Hello, YouTubers and military connoisseurs. We have another episode of CollectRussia.com YouTube channel, and it will be a very unusual and I think wonderful treat today. You see me in the role that I don't usually take. I am going to be the interviewer today, and we have a very special guest who has a fantastic story. It's a life story of several generations of soldiers. And I will be mostly silent because he has a lot to say and a lot to show you today. And of course it has to do with military and medal collecting, but it's also an incredible story of generations of soldiers. So with that, I present to you Alan. He is an avid medal collector, a soldier. So Alan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. It is a great privilege to be here today with you, Igor. And to those of you out there, greetings. I hope that you will be pleasantly entertained and filled with a great deal of wisdom, as what we are going to discuss today is primarily military genealogy with the awards and other accoutrements that would have been possibly earned by my family members who, through many years of painful and detailed research, was able to decipher a credible amount of military, war, everything that we love to study. So with that, I will introduce how basically I went through this process to determine who these people were and what their military story was really all about, you know, which is for a lot of families something that is a huge mystery, and it is a very complex and sophisticated process to try to get down to who did what, who were they assigned to, what conflicts they were involved in. So I myself am a 14th generation soldier, 6 generations consecutive. So what that means is, starting with one of my 12th great-grandfathers all the way down to my 5th great-grandfather's generations, there was a continuous line of soldiering. And then there is a break so far. I have yet to find somebody in my 4th great-grandfather's time frame, but I haven't found them all yet. So there still remains a possibility that I could be a 15 consecutive generation soldier.
That just sounds incredible.
It is.
And these 15 generations, you're tracing all the lines. You know who your ancestors were. And, and you know what medals they got and what campaigns they were in.
Well, yes. So when the medals were, not everybody's medals, and medals didn't come out until later in history. But yes, so starting with one of my 12th great-grandfathers, he was in the British Navy during the time of the Anglo-Spanish War. So from your history books, you would know that as the Spanish Armada, right, of 1588.
Elizabeth the Great.
Right, yep. And during that time, they had, it was like a 20-year-long war. So later, after that Spanish Armada, there were a successive series of British armadas,
raids.
English armadas that were sent to attack Spain. And
I know they raided a lot of Spanish possessions in America, in South America, for example, and that was a big prize.
Privateers, pirates, all kinds of stuff. So in his case, I do not know the actual ship he was on, but history says that he was
one of the ships raiding.
He was a sailor. He was involved in the war, and later he came to the United States in the very beginning of the colonies, around 1623, and he was a captain by then of his own vessel. But he was not a soldier at that time when he came to the U.S. as part of one of the colonies that one of the companies in England had backed and were financing. So during that time, history says that he was the first coroner in North America. And so the situation.
Do you know where exactly he landed, or what?
Yes,
what
there was
colony?
a colony, and the name of it is slipping my mind because he's not the topic of the discussion today. But
it's interesting that there are this deep American roots.
He eventually that colony actually failed, and it merged with the Salem, Massachusetts colony. So he was part of the Massachusetts Bay colonies at that time, which was quite large. If concluded Rhode Island and Connecticut.
Right.
But anyways, he then that colony failed, so those colonists then merged with Salem, you know, in that point. But anyways, from that time, and that is on my mother's side of the family. So, and then on my father's side of the family, which was what brings us here today, to bring it down to Imperial Russia. So my father's family was in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in what is now to Lublin, Poland, and Rokitno, Ukraine, Western Ukraine. But at the time, and we'll talk about this, how the borders would eventually fluctuate, you know, back and forth. But when Russia, Imperial Russia, took over that section,
Poland.
Yeah, they got
divided
during
Poland
the partitions, during the partitions. So between the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians, and they ended up in Imperial Russia. And so this was around the Napoleonic time, or before that, it was 1795 or something.
The first division of Poland.
Division. But then there was a Duchy of Warsaw, and so my family line has multiple soldiers, you know, operating at different times, and so that is why we're going to.
But just to emphasize, we are talking about Jewish.
Yes, these are Jewish Imperial Russian
subjects.
Subjects, yes.
And maybe many of the viewers that are watching us today may know it already, but for those who don't, Russian Jews generally came as an accident. They were not intrinsic to Russian Empire, and they got acquired with the mostly Polish territories. When Poland got divided, there was a substantial number of Jews living in Poland, or Lithuania, what used to be Poland, and this is how they became subject of Russian Empire. And Russian Empire, this was totally new because it was pretty uniformly Christian Orthodox, or there were also Muslim subjects, but Jews was an entirely new thing, and they simply didn't know what to do about it.
Right.
So,
and through history and research and some outstanding professional researchers and professors, they have unmasked and unraveled this mystery of what happened with Jews in the Imperial Russian Army, and then how it evolved ever thereafter, right? So in the beginning, when the Jews were taken in by Imperial Russia, they were forbidden from serving in the military. So there was a concerted effort. And yes, you will probably find an individual Jew or two that, you know, for whatever reason ended up in the military somehow. But as we know, they were strictly segregated. They were in the Pale of Settlement. They could not easily traverse terrain, or they were not even allowed to move without permission outside.
Sure.
And I don't even know how, I'm not sure exactly how strict it was within the Pale, but definitely difficulties in trading and other things outside of there. So this had a profound effect on the society. And then after the Napoleonic Wars, you had a series of you'll have to forgive me for all the emperors of Russia, but I believe it was Nicholas the First.
Alexander the First, who defeated Napoleon,
and then his brother, right, was his younger brother that was Nicholas the First.
Right, who took over.
Yes, and so he began making concerted efforts to bring Jews, starting to bring them, incorporate them into the military. But his policies were
pretty brutal.
Draconic.
Right. They would simply come and grab them.
Yes.
And many changed their names, by the way. This is how many Jewish names became Russified in a way. And I'm sure my family name, Moiseev, is one of those names that got changed somewhat to sound more Russian. But if you research the last name, it's certainly of Jewish, has Jewish origins, but it got Russified.
And this is why
this is when it started.
Yes, and it gets to confuse those of us in the modern era who are trying to reverse engineer who are these people and what is the genealogy here. So if you are not aware of these nuances, it will be quite difficult. So in this section, what we're going to talk about is when you get the feel for how complicated it is, you will begin to appreciate why men like Igor exist out there and have
For
such
good.
an expertise on these subjects because
For better or worse.
yeah, I think for better. I am here with him because this is a full circle on him helping me, and we'll dive into that in the research where he was instrumental in identifying certain things that I was completely unaware of, in my family history.
Way too much credit. But Alan, again, returning to the family roots and Russian part of it. So now we are talking events that followed the Napoleonic Wars, and you said that you can trace this generations of soldiers starting from there.
Well, post Napoleon for sure. So there's an evolution of how Jews eventually are fully incorporated into the military. So with all the draconian effect that wasn't very helpful, they found the Crimean War was fought, and they had a lot of inherent weaknesses in the military and their design overall. So they required a massive reformation of military laws and how the structure overall was fielded in force. So what we come to is the law of 1874. And this is...
And can you explain what...
Yes. So Alexander II is now the emperor at this time.
Right.
And
after
he
the
is...
death of
after Nicholas I.
Who started the war.
Right. And he looked back on his predecessors' reforms and treatment of soldiers and etc. and realized this all has to change. But Alexander had to do other reforms in advance.
Well, he was a great reformer. He's known as a reformer.
Correct.
Emperor,
and he
liberated serfs eventually.
And, exactly. And so finally he gets around to changing the army. And there is a vested interest in keeping the army the way it is because of the nobles and other people, their advantages.
Sure,
and
there was a tremendous resistance.
Yes, and it's just so much change in the culture and everything had to be implemented.
Right.
So when this came in 1874, the basics were all Jews who were 20 years old in that year of 1874 were now eligible for conscription.
Right.
And this is how my second great-grandfather, Avrom, was conscripted that year with that original class of conscripts.
And his name was Avram, right?
Avram. Yes. And
in Russian way of sounding it and how it eventually evolved would be Abram.
Abram. Yes, I've heard both. Yes. So again, this goes back to what language are we talking about and how to pronounce it. So again, it will confuse a lot of people if they don't know what they're actually looking for, because you can see even the changes, in Russian documents.
Yes, which is very confusing. That's why research is so difficult sometimes, because you need to understand how the name could evolve and change, and how it could even be misspelled.
Exactly, or even on purpose sometimes, to distinguish a cousin. Or even a brother sometimes, like someone in there. So he ends up joining, and then history shows that you have the Russo-Turkish War. Now, what is interesting about Jews at the time that this law was implemented is that, according to Professor Johann Petrovsky-Stern, that 90% of the Jews were sent to combat arms. And 75% of that were sent to infantry. So
that's pretty astonishing, because you wouldn't expect that they would rely on Jews that, of course, did not have military experience or military lineage at that time, military training necessarily. You wouldn't expect them to be put in the infantry, but it turns out that most of them actually were.
And that seems to be not necessarily by accident, because we'll find later in a country like Poland, when it's recreated, that they actually did this with soldiers to integrate them, as a kind of quick way of integrating them into the society. And
it made sense.
And not have to spend a lot of money training them. Okay. So this is another thing, is that money, where are you going to put it? Artillery is expensive.
Right.
And so all of that stuff. So, and then there's also the cannon fodder reason. You never, that's always a consideration.
So that was cheap, kind of.
Exactly. So you have a large pool of manpower. The infantry is generally the most physically rigorous. I'm sure there are people out there who could debate that, but overall, especially in that era, definitely physically strenuous. And so he was part of the Army of the Danube. I am not able to identify his exact regiment, who he was with in the beginning, but they would serve 6 years active duty. So by 1880, he would have completed his active duty assignment, and then they had to give 9 more years in the reserves. So that would have been basically your 15 years.
It's still very short compared to the previous
what it was,
practice
yes.
of conscripting basically for life.
Yes.
Because in the early days, under Nicholas I and Alexander, it was practically a lifetime occupation once somebody was drafted.
Exactly.
The person would probably never return to his native village, because after spending 25 or 30 years in the military, he lost any connection with his original family, with the land. He would lose.
He was a complete alien to his society at that point.
And it's very tragic. But when they bade farewell to a son who was going into the army, they knew they would never see him again.
Exactly.
It was a certain thing. It wasn't about him getting killed necessarily, but just the fact that he was there for life.
Absolutely.
And then when they retired, they would still live near military settlements, and
because they had no technical skills.
Exactly.
Into
Everybody they knew back when they were children would be, alien to them at that point. So they would typically marry, if they married at all, and they would settle somewhere near the military base, so to speak.
And one interesting thing about this Reformation, specifically for the Jews, is that they were allowed to serve locally. They were allowed to remain in their local
so that's
area,
very different from
and
the
very
normal
different
practice.
from everyone else, who could have been far flung, and it's possible that they could have been sent out anyways.
Alan, it's very interesting because even in the Soviet days, and I'm talking about my personal experience living in the Soviet Union when I came of age in the 80s, they would deliberately send a new conscript far away from home, as far as possible.
Yes.
It was a deliberate policy. So what you are saying is very interesting.
It is, and it's shocking because a lot of Imperial Russian military experts are not aware of the Jewish side of things. And so it causes them confusion as to, this soldier couldn't have been here because that's not the standard practice, etc. But in truth, it was. So
amazing.
Yeah, this is, in some ways, if you look back on American history and their history of segregated soldiers in the army, it's not identical, but there were several weird quirks that you need to be aware of, right, in order to understand how that happened. And this is very similar. This is just one of those scenarios, and there were quirks built into it that mollified or pacified the people from protesting too much, I suppose, right?
I understand.
And so what ended up happening is a major influence on the Jewish society at that time. Rabbis who had been previously anti-military were now embracing it and actually wanted and encouraged men to do their best and give everything they've got to
How interesting. So they essentially played the same role as Orthodox priests.
Yes, and they began allowing rabbis into the, as a priest would, and they made special Jewish battalions for Orthodox and others. But my ancestors were always infantry and regular army. That is a very straight regular army infantrymen, which is where the majority would have gone, right? But the Russian Empire went out of their way in many ways to accommodate, and they had a completely different perspective on how they were treating the Jews at this point, and all of the records that I've been able to read for myself that have obviously been translated tell us that the officers thought very well of the Jews who came into their units. They performed admirably during the Russo-Turkish War.
Possibly because of education level. Generally, Jewish boys, girls too, probably.
Literacy is very high.
Were literate.
Yes, and that helped.
They were expected to be.
So you would end up with Jews as being messengers and runners and things like that because they were, for whatever reason, trusted in those positions to get records and things that had to do with literacy. They were very focused, and they became clerks. And so you see this evolution over time later where they will then be allowed to kind of move into what naturally an
progress in
individual,
society.
yes, would have done well at, right?
It's interesting because it reminds me a list of recipients of, you wouldn't believe it, pour le mérite, the highest Prussian award, from the time of Franco-Prussian War, when Russia was an ally of Prussia. Things were very different than
they
what
did the
turned out
same
to
during
be.
the Napoleonic War. They gave pour le mérite to the
Right,
Russian officers for that as well when they did the land campaign to Paris.
But you know what's most astonishing? What was most astonishing to me is when I read the list of names, there were a lot of Jewish names.
Yeah.
And these were obviously officers who got baptized almost for sure.
Yeah.
But nobody would make a question an issue of their Jewish origin. So if you compare it with the situation in the Soviet Union that I experienced with, it's very different. But back then, apparently, that it was not an issue at all. So whoever wanted to join the military and become a professional soldier, professional officer, was allowed to do that. And lo and behold, they were highest decoration of the era imposed on.
And that's exactly what, under Nicholas, he tried to Christianize a lot of the Jews. That was an actual policy.
Right.
And they would pay bonuses to the regimental commanders for the people who got baptized. And so it created corruption because people would fake it, and now they can make money, and who's going to verify? And then eventually they go and check and they say, why are there so many in this one battalion who are converting and not another one? And that would get the officer maybe reprimanded or in some trouble because then they realize he's pulling a scam or something, and these kinds of, doctrines or dictates from the top down are never really thought through, for the kind of community that they actually,
consequences.
Yeah, there's always, and it becomes very laughable, like we are doing now. How the results were, but
returning to your soldier ancestor.
Yes. So now Avram create. So there's this pattern then that gets created where father son will begin joining the military because over time now, as the forthcoming generations are born, everything begins to change. Before it was very universal, lots of people, nobles, everybody. It was pretty straight across the board, including the Jews, right? And then what ended up occurring is that people began figuring out ways to game the system, and kind of lax in certain regions and more strict in others, and which is typical of whoever the bureaucrat in charge is and the consortium of individuals who implement it. And so eventually, by the time his son, his name is Shmuel, joins the military in about 1903 or 1904 at the latest, because he is the eldest, it is now culturally where the eldest son will voluntarily go in order to protect the rest of his brothers from getting conscripted. And so you'll see that this is very typical. And
so they would just take one from the family, same as for Russian families.
Correct. So they would just take that one. If it was, and I don't know if it was exactly just if it was the elder, but I know if the elder brother went in, you were going to protect the rest from having to go in unless they volunteer. So this now becomes a staple in the Jewish society, where a lot of them keep joining and for that specific reason. And you'll see big families and none of the other people go in, right? And then you will also see that they could not conscript you if you were married. So you'll see a lot of 19-year-olds getting married
as soon as possible.
As soon as possible. And I have family that did that. I can actually look and see my other ancestors who did not want to serve in the army and therefore got married at 18, 19 years old. And they would marry a 20, 21-year-old, 23-year-old woman to get out of that, so that's how it was affecting everybody. So the combat exploits of Avram, I do not have specifics because I don't know his exact, but I know he was at the Danube. I know that he would have been right there with that group because they marshaled all of the people from those western regions. They didn't have the military districts yet, but all the units that were based in those areas were the primary forces that were constituted to invade that region of what is now Romania and their liberation war. So This is where it begins.
So he was
where-
eligible, of course, for the Russo-Turkish War medal.
Yes. So he was
Light bronze.
there, yeah, and then, you know, based on my family history of performing incredible feats during war, I see no reason why that just somehow spontaneously happened. Like, there is a long history of this kind of behavior from my side of the family doing quite well, and we'll get into that. So where I have now two of my great-grandfathers now going down, there were two of my great-grandfathers who were in the Imperial Russian Army, and two of my American great-grandfathers were in the American Army. And of course, they were different times, but all four of them were in World War I. So my great-grandfathers, Leisure and Shmuel, both of them joined. Leisure was in 1902. It would have been about the time that he would have been conscripted. Although I do not know his actual unit, original, I know who his reserve unit was when he completed. And at this time, the infantrymen only had to serve 4 years active duty, but they still had to serve 15 years total.
So the rest of it was
11
reserves.
years in the reserves. And this is why they ended up in World War I. Because
but not, sorry for interrupting,
Yeah.
but not in Russo-Japanese War that you know.
I don't know that, but there's a possibility. There's still a possibility.
1904, 1905, there was a
Correct.
major war with Japan. But of course, it would take a long time for the Eastern forces, for the Western forces to go to the
Well,
east.
here's what
so
I researched.
much of the war was fought with whatever was available on hand.
In the beginning,
the
but what they
Pacific
did,
theater.
this is, and you may not know this, but what I found was that during the war then, you had like the First Manchurian Army and, you know, others, the Siberian Army and whatever. So what they did is they would take reinforcements, you know, people to replace the losses from the Western districts, because at that point now they did have their military districts. And so the Warsaw and the Kiev military districts were, what they would do, as I understand, is they would take companies out of regiments.
Each regiment.
Yeah,
Yes,
one company at a
absolutely.
time, and
Absolutely.
out of
That
a
was-
battalion, and then they would send
They
them
would
over there.
replace it and train the next
Exactly,
one. Yeah.
and then they would
That
make-
was since Napoleonic Wars. That was the practice.
Okay, so there's that. That is why there's a possibility that they could have actually ended up fighting there, but I don't know. I have not been able to identify, because now it gets very complicated, because no longer would they even be considered part of the original regiment. They would now be categorized as under one of the army regiments of Manchuria or Siberia that were in that fight.
see.
And so I would need to get my hands on those records, which are not easy to find.
But in the meantime, we can imagine that
Yes, there's a
there is a
possibility.
possibility. So there's a possibility you may need the Russo-Japanese
I
war.
very well may need that. Yes.
You see what I'm driving?
I know. I thought this through very carefully. I just didn't want, without confirmation, I felt like I could not just throw it on there, you know, to say
sure,
that
sure,
it's it.
sure.
But very interesting. And he is, and this is my ancestor Leisure, that he most likely could have been there in Russia, but not certain. But he has a very long history of conflict we'll get into now with World War I. Okay. So World War I know a lot better from my family members, because I actually know the regiments that they were fighting with during that time. And what ended up occurring is that when they finished, whoever their specific regiment was from the original, and assuming they were not in the Russian-Japanese War, but came back, they would then be assigned to the local regiment for wherever they were living. Okay. And because they were infantry, it's an infantry regiment. And in the case of Leisure, he was in Lublin, and the regiment there was the 69th Infantry Regiment, the 69th Ryazan Infantry Regiment.
And just to remind, Lublin was, of course, the part of Poland at the time, which was Russian Empire.
Yes. And so he would have been there basically from anywhere as early as 1906, 1907, in that time frame, and then he was still there when World War I began. And my other great-grandfather, Shmuel, he was in the 166th Ravno or Rivny Infantry Regiment, depending on if we're talking Ukrainian or Russian, but they were part of the Kiev Military District, and that regiment was located in Kiev. And so whenever,
even though it was a Rovno, Rivne.
correct. So yeah, the
regiment.
city name may have been given to it for a number of reasons. It could have been its original
but they were
place.
physically to the east.
Correct, and they get relocated, and you'll see sometimes they could be in a location for 50 years, and other times they bounce around. So
Sure.
in this case, they were pretty strict. The 166th was actually created during the Russian-Turkish War of 1877.
Mm-hmm.
So they would not have a badge of their own by the time, because they were 100 years, for that, which is another side notes, So the 69th had their own. And I believe you had a picture of that in one of your books that maybe we can, we'll implement that in the video. Yeah. And anyways, the very unique history around those, okay, and what you had to do for that. So going to now the beginning of World War I, so when I'll show some medals here in a minute, but what we'll discuss is some of the history, why some of the medals for sure they would have had, and then others, likely would have had, and then just to show the history that they were involved in there for that. So in the First World War, there's the mobilization. And when Russia mobilizes, they have a very large army, very large.
And very fast, too. That
Very
was
fast.
astonishing
It
to
shocked the
both allies and
yes.
especially the Germans.
It shocked the Germans and it shocked the Austrians.
You could say that because of the speed of Russian mobilization, the entire Schlieffen plan
failed
because Germans essentially panicked, at least the commanders.
They had to keep more
facing
people on
the
the
Russians,
eastern side than they had
and they
anticipated.
started siphoning troops off of
Exactly.
very important Western Front.
Yes,
and that's what saved France in 1914.
So where my family was fighting was originally against the Austrians. So
southern flank,
the southwestern kind of flanks.
Lviv area.
Yep.
And,
Exactly. So
Lemberg.
Exactly. So Lemberg is the first battle for the Fourth Army, which is what the 166. So
and initially it was very successful, correct?
It was very
for
successful.
For the Russian.
And let me tell you, the 166 was assigned to the 42nd Infantry Division, and that's important. That is really important because as I described this, he was in a different area that made no sense. Why eventually he will be wounded, and I could not understand what he was doing in that area until we researched what happened to the divisions and how they move around, during the conflict. So he begins, and they have success right away. They're fighting in Lemberg. They take the town. There's a lot of propaganda in the Imperial Russia, a lot of happiness. And
yes, because everybody expected that the war would be soon over.
Yes.
Austrians
but that,
humiliated. And
well, we know that didn't happen. Right?
Well, Germans intervened.
So there are two events that
was
happened that kind of threw this all off. The 69th Infantry Regiment was part of the 18th Infantry Division, and they were part of the Third Army.
Or Southwestern Front?
Yes, same front. So what if we will maybe put a map into this, digitally, so you can see the combat route for both of my great-grandfathers. But what ended up happening is that the 4th and the 3rd Armies converged at the fortress of Przemysl. Thank you. So
that's a hard one for me.
Yeah, I am not even.
But it was a key location.
Yes,
this is where a lot of bloodshed took place.
Horrific battle starts. Yes, and I just want to please forgive me for mispronouncing any Eastern European names there.
I'll try to help
as
much as I can. I won't be always good at it. But speaking of Przemysl, it took such a big part in Russian psyche, in propaganda and everything. So much revolved around it, and of course it went on and off.
Yes, so there are two phases to this. There's the initial battle, and you can look this up on Wikipedia and others, and you will see that the casualty rate there exceeded over 100,000 Russians in the space of about 4 days.
That's pretty hard to wrap your hand around.
It's impossible to consider how brutal.
So this is absolutely the level of worse than Western Front and all the most famous
There's
battles.
No comparison. I mean, you can talk about the Battle of the Somme, you can talk about Verdun, but that's what we're talking about.
Verdun is probably the best comparison.
Yeah, exactly. So we're talking about that scale pretty much throughout the Eastern
But
Front.
it was probably more liquid, more fluid battle than Verdun, because there was a lot of movement of both sides.
They had room to maneuver around the fortress, but what made this so bloody is the Austrians had about 110,000 soldiers in the fortress.
Well entrenched.
Yes.
This was called a fortress for a reason.
For a reason. And the Russians were never artillery heavy. You know, they never had enough artillery, right? They were infantry heavy. They had lots of soldiers
Masses
in the
of
beginning.
soldiers.
And they just got
What a
slaughtered.
contrast with World War II, right?
Yeah, how do you...
They learned the lesson. In World War II, it was opposite.
Exactly. They had tons of artillery.
They had incredible amount of artillery.
But the lack of artillery is demonstrable in this situation because you can see how human beings are just running against stone walls and machine gun fire and artillery coming off of the cannonades, you know, coming off of the towers and stuff. And, you know, it's just a slaughter, just a huge slaughter. And from that point on, you know, anybody who is fighting throughout this time frame, as you continue, the likelihood of you dying is exponential.
Yeah.
You know, getting wounded, and that's the easy thing. You know,
so you have two ancestors
who are at the same battle,
in the same battle, one of the bloodiest of the entire
whole war,
or what they call Great War.
Yeah, exactly.
The war that you could say changed the world for.
And these are all professional soldiers.
For the worst.
These are senior soldiers. They've been in the military for many years, a lot of them. You know, you're losing men who have 10, 15, 20, 30 years of all kinds, like officers and high-ranking sergeant majors, you know, everything is just being completely mowed down during this time. And so then they stop because of necessity, and they set up a siege. And now the Third Army kind of moves off and goes to a different front, and now the Fourth Army lays siege to this into 1915, and ultimately they take the fortress.
Yeah, but
because the interior they're so horrible. The Austrians have their own nightmare of situation taking place, and sieges are never good, especially when you have a lot of people and you run out of food quickly and medical supplies, and then you've got dysentery and typhus and you know, God knows all the rest.
It was trumped as a huge. It was considered a huge victory.
It was,
but it was very short-lived.
Short-lived, because then what follows is the Great Retreat of 1915, when the Germans and the Austrians go into a major counterattack, and at this point, you can tell the Russian army has been bled heavily. You know, I mean, I've read estimates as over 1 million casualties have been absorbed by this point.
That's really unprecedented.
All across the board.
Any wars of the past.
Never so fast and never that many.
Less massive armies, of course, no machine guns.
Yeah.
Much lower casualty rate.
And you can see this has been, you know, discussed in throughout many historians. You know, the people back then did not understand the technology they had at their disposal. They did not appreciate.
Even generals.
No.
They
None
would
of them.
throw troops at the
They could not. They did not appreciate the killing ability
of machine gun,
exactly,
and
efficiency,
gas,
etc.
and artillery.
Yeah, and so this created unprecedented levels of heroism. You know, of bravery. We're watching men just climbing over the top of a trench, wave after wave after wave. You know, the 10th wave, the 12th wave. Yeah, what is motivating them to keep going when they saw the 1,000, 2,000 other guys ahead of them getting blown to pieces? You know, in front of them, they just keep going. So it's a testament to the kinds of how human beings thought about themselves, I think, in that area, and just the overall psyche of those generations. You know. So, Shmuel, this great retreat causes the 42nd to break off from the Fourth Army, and they are now attached to. And I'm not going to have the detail on hand, but one of the other armies that was now in the Baranovici front. Mm-hmm. You know, so this is important because when we show a map, when they retreated. You have
that's already closer to Belarus.
Yes, because there's the Pripyat marshes, and the great.
And this was a natural barrier.
Correct for the north and the south, and you cannot just proceed right through it because it's several hundred miles wide, you know. So you have, and so this is why he never comes home, because the soldiers during the war were not just given leave, you know, to just head back. And he definitely never got back. When they left at 1914, both of my great-grandfathers, they would not return until 1990.
After the war.
After the war. And for two different reasons. And so one of the things I see there that is so interesting is that when in summer of 1916, when the Brusilov offensive begins, they have simultaneously the Baranovichi offensive that occurs. And it was supposed to kind of draw resources.
Yeah, but it was very unsuccessful.
It was horrible.
They didn't
horrible.
get anywhere.
Nowhere.
I don't think they even broke through the first line. And at that point, they were facing mostly Germans, as I understand.
Yes. So in Baranovichi, they're fighting, but there were Austrians present in that area as well.
Right.
And this is why when you see how this battle unfolded, apparently, I guess he was a general at this time, Everett. He was in charge of that army up there. And they had not enough artillery. He delayed the offensive by several days. That he was supposed to attack simultaneously with Brusilov, who was attacking the Austrians down in the southwest, and he had to be ordered many times to begin the offensive
because he knew that it
was worthless, right?
Futile.
Yeah, but they kept wanting something to happen so that reserves could not be reallocated down to make up for the losses that were occurring on the other front, right? So in his defense, he just knew the outcome. He knew the outcome, right? But they sent them ahead.
So he had the direct order.
He had the direct order, and the 166th is wiped out. I mean, like, just
so
completely destroyed. So my great-grandfather Shmuel was shot by machine gun fire. I know this because my grandfather told me this. This is how I knew he was a soldier to start with. And he did not know very much about it, but he knew the years, and he knew where he was. This is how I was able to deduce what regiment could have. There's only one division that could have, been out there at that time from the region where he was originally from. And these guys, he was taken POW along with a lot of other soldiers there, and most likely ended up at the prison camp of Mauthausen in Austria, which would later become a death camp. Yeah, in World War II. But it was definitely a death camp in World War I, because it was so horrible.
Because of the
disease and the slave labor they made them do, and very little food, and just a horrific environment by all accounts. And I don't know exact, but I've read as many as 50% died of these POWs.
That was probably a norm of the time. You can't even blame them because there were no means, and that was considered absolutely appropriate. And if you look at past history, American prison camps during the American Civil War.
Yeah,
you look
horrible
at the casualty
conditions.
rate.
Everything is terrible.
Terrible.
POWs are not getting the medical treatment first. They're not the highest priority. Even their own soldiers no longer have medical treatment of quality in many ways. So seeing how these guys...
So he survives this horrible
slaughter.
That
nightmare of...
Just gets wounded.
All of that.
He gets into concentration camp.
He's there 2.5 years.
In the POW camp.
Yep.
And he's already wounded, so his health is compromised. He has much lesser chances of surviving.
You would think.
Than an average
You would think,
POW
yes.
in that camp.
And all the odds are stacked against him, and he survives it.
That's
and you have to think about this. It's also interesting. Leisure and Shmuel have very interesting parallels in their personal life, where they both lost their first child. Okay, so Leisure lost a child when it was just a few months old, but then he had another child just before the war began in 1913. He will not have another child, who is my grandmother, until 1920.
Because that's when he
come back, right? So he came back at the very end of 1919. So then there's this giant gap. And the same thing with my other great-grand Shmuel. He was able to... he had a child when he left. He had a boy. Then he had my grandfather. My great-grandmother was pregnant with him when Shmuel left. And my grandfather, who we are going to discuss next, he was born in October of 1914. And so he never even saw him. And by the time he came home in 1919, he came home in January 1919. When most of the POWs finally were released, even though the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had been signed in March of 1918.
It still took a long time.
It still took a long time to release them because they did not want them to be fighting in the Civil War. And so they just kept them from going over there, So finally, when Germany surrenders totally, in November 1918, they still kept the POWs from Russia.
Unbelievable.
Until they were forced, finally forced to send them out. So in that in that story, right, you see where for him to return, his oldest son is now dead. His oldest son died in 1918. I'm not sure why, but probably due to a combination of not known food insecurity.
Of course, no, it was a difficult time for civilians.
And there were
1918
raiding vagabond, soldiers, banditry.
Sure.
They called it brigandage.
All the soldiers that left the front.
And there was also the Civil War taking place at that time, and there's just mass chaos all over the place. And a miracle that even my grandfather survived with his mother, right, and then in Lejor's case, his wife was taking care of his one child in Lublin that was occupied by the Austrians for the entirety of the war after 1915. So from 1915 until 1918, Lublin was under Austrian occupation. And so, there's the stress on their mind, of the soldier thinking, where's my family? Not only am I going to die out here, but are my wife and children, are they safe? Are they secure? One guy is worried about one side being under occupation. The other one has knowledge that because even in the POW camps, they knew that there was a civil war. They knew that the Russian government had collapsed. Absolutely. So news was making.
So Lejor was in POW camp until
Shmuel was in the POW camp.
And what happens with Lejor?
So now Lejor's history is a mystery. What, aside from the fact that he was with the 69th and he does not show any injuries or anything like that over his life, because my grandmother never discussed him having a limp or some other kind of massive scar or something that would have been identifiable with that usually. I'm not sure why he does not come back until about November, December of 1919. So there's a possibility he could have been in the war there. I know that the commander of the 18th Infantry Division joined the Civil War.
On the side of...
I believe he was on the Russian communist side, on the Reds.
That's very unusual. And typically they would have to grab the family of the officer hostage. Some officers joined voluntarily.
Yes.
But high officers, especially a general or a colonel, a regiment commander, division commander, it was highly unusual. And the way the Bolsheviks, the practice was to take family hostage and say, well...
And I know that happened later, but this is, again, a mystery to me, and I'm sure there's an expert out there somewhere who would know exactly how this kind of broke down. But some of these regiments would en masse join the Reds or the Whites, right? And it could be like maybe not the colonel of the regiment, but the sergeant major of the regiment decided to join the Reds and brought everyone else with them, or something could have happened like this. And
there was some fighting even while they were at the front between various units.
Like
depending on what their politics
was. Absolutely. And very chaotic, just very chaotic. I don't even we can't even say that it was controlled violence. It was just somebody
sporadic,
heard something,
right.
and they found out these guys.
There was a lot of paranoia.
It is, and the breakdown of orderliness is self-evident, like when you start reading about what is going on from 17, 18, 19, 20.
It's unbelievable.
And then there's the Polish-Soviet War that is taking place at the exact same time.
Right.
And Trotsky tries to march to Berlin, but he gets stopped at Warsaw. And so maybe Lejor was with the Polish army, could have been, and fighting in that regard. So it's still an open question what is the full story about him, but definitely,
that would be interesting to find out.
Absolutely, because he could have been in the Russian-Japanese War.
In theory, he could be anything.
World War I.
He could have been even with the White forces of the South. Fighting under Denikin, possibly,
and fighting
against.
Yes, and so there is historically limited information about the exact, history of some of these regiments and divisions, and definitely requires continuing study and research, which I am more than happy to engage in, as I love this so much. So yes, their stories, and then Shmuel had a son, my grandfather. His name was Aaron, and we'll talk about his exploits
when we get to
that part. So, this legacy of genealogy and military heritage we can see is now fully invested into the Jewish community. They are very patriotic towards Imperial Russia. Jews have often been maligned incorrectly as being antagonistic to whatever society maybe that they were in and would not assimilate completely. This is, not the case with what we are seeing on the majority of the Jews in Russia.
There was a side of it that is certainly true, and that
it depends on the era
for
we're talking about.
very obvious sometimes reasons. That yes, there was definitely segregation. There was definitely a pale, and of course it bred huge discontent.
Mm-hmm.
And let's not hide it. A lot of early Bolshevik leaders were Jews.
Yes, of course.
Very large percentage, because they were feeling alienated by the Tsarist.
Yes,
Tsarist regime.
Absolutely.
And actually, the policy got much worse during Nicholas II.
That's correct. And this book here tells the story of how initially they did not want to be anti-Semitic, but some defense ministers were anti-Semitic who came into power later and began implementing ridiculous rules and regulations. And this is why you see from after the Russian-Turkish War, the kind of egalitarian, everybody is involved kind of, we're all in this together disappears. And now
Right.
I can pay somebody to take my place, I can get somebody else, or I can, look for some, ways to get out of service.
Yeah,
and this happens universal across the system because so many little changes over the decades reaches a point where people have incentive not to go, now there's no longer, not for everyone, but there's definitely that element has become much larger. And when we see the effect of that, right, you begin to notice how the quality of the officers have changed. There was a time where the officers were extraordinarily professional. Then they try to get them into all these academies.
What they call the father to the soldiers.
Right, and then you find more of a, I bought my way in, or I found somebody political patron is promoting me, and
no, the quality had declined.
Yes, and even the great ones, even if you look at a guy like Brusilov, he was hamstrung by incompetent guys below them. You can find down the line, and so the warfare is never perfect on any side. But when we're talking about the society and what's integrating, and it definitely was in the Jewish community, the military had fulfilled one of its original goals, was to assimilate them into the country, into the empire. And I would say that by World War I, they had become fully, integrated, and there was a lot of patriotism. And you'll hear this about Jews in the German army, Jews
Absolutely.
in the Austrian
I was about
army,
to say
Jews
that
in the French army.
Same situation.
Same in every country,
War,
right?
yeah.
And whatever country they were part of, they wanted to, fight and be patriotic, right? And that is not unusual. I don't understand why, it would even be so difficult for people to believe that. But regardless, there is anti-Semitism, and it does come from official sources, later on and during this period between 1874 and 1914. And then whenever things go bad, Jews generally get blamed, for things.
It's an easy target.
And so, in their case, my ancestors have a proven background of showing up, fighting where they're supposed to fight, did their time, completed everything, and then, if it were not for the fall of the Russian Empire, I'm sure they would have, been able to integrate, get their medals, find all these things. But by the time they get home, there is no Russian government anymore, to accommodate them. So we'll, if you want, we can show.
Yeah, now maybe we can discuss the specific decorations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I give my logic behind why I selected these, because the paperwork is available for some, but not for others. And it's really a story of hit and miss and getting lucky if you can find your ancestors' documents. This is why Igor was able to help me find at least one of my ancestors and get that.
I made a very little contribution, but you've researched it so well, and you know what medals your great grandfathers were.
Yeah, and my second great grandfather possible, and You know, so it's all about possibilities. What could they
Right,
have
but
earned?
this is what makes collecting interesting, because
Very
there's
interesting.
a historical
Yeah.
background, and there is what makes history come alive, because
Right.
you actually can touch the artifacts
Exactly,
from
and
the
that-
period, not necessarily
and
the ones
see
that
them.
belong to one of your ancestors, but just like them.
Exactly, and to know, you know, I'm
the
sure
same war.
many people have looked at their ancestors' medals of different kinds, and I have some of my American ancestors' medals.
But
you
the
know,
actual medals that
the
they
actu-
did receive.
right,
You know.
and the reason why is because the records for the United States are better kept during that time, and you know,
The
but
United States never lost the war.
but
They're talking a country that suffered through major calamities,
Of course.
and actually lost World War I.
and then there's another government that comes in and intentionally destroys records
Everything, yeah,
and things that they
associated
don't
with the past.
like, and you know, so when you sift through all that, the Russian history is a very fascinating, challenging, and complex way to do military genealogy, for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. No, that was quite a feat. What you've done is mind-boggling. But
Thank you.
let's get to the medals now,
Yeah.
and perhaps you will tell us the story of each one in particular and what was the logic.
Yep, absolutely.
And we will show our viewers what we have. So, Alan, why don't you tell us about this first set of beautiful medals, what they are, and why you think your great-grandfather received those?
Absolutely.
Or could have received.
Yeah,
those.
could have. Yeah. So this would be Avrom's medal rack here, or ribbon rack, and with the medals. And what we have are the Danube crossing cross. It's called the Cross of the Danube
Of the
crossing.
And this
for
is
the
a non-Russian medal.
Yes, and
This
this is a
Romanian
Romanian medal. But I'm just going to go from right to left. So, and then we'll talk about the precedents
in
and
the order of importance.
Exactly. And so, this is the campaign medal, which is the Russian medal for the Russo-Turkish War, and we'll see how it is in bronze, light bronze.
It's what they call, it's really brass.
Brass,
But
yeah.
there were two versions of it now that
Correct.
you mentioned.
And the dark version was for people who were non-combatants.
Exactly.
And the light version was for the combatants.
For the combatants exclusively.
Exactly.
So your ancestor would definitely receive the light bronze.
Exactly, because
brass
he was
version.
infantry, right? And I'll let you talk about the ribbons and their significance and all, but here we have the Zeal medal, and you'll notice that this is Alexander III, even though the fight was with Alexander II, right? And you can discuss and elaborate what the Zeal medal, I guess, was the significance. But
Right.
and then we have here a Zovo cross for St. George. And
When you say
Well, it wasn't
Zovo, you have to explain why is it called Zovo.
yeah, you have the expertise on
The
that.
original name of the St. George Cross wasn't St. George Cross. The original name was Badge of Distinction of the Military Order. The military order being Order of St. George. Now, Order of St. George was a very important and very honorable decoration that could only be awarded to officers. St. George, what we now know as a St. George Cross, and what was originally Badge of Distinction of the Military Order, was a continuation of the Order of St. George. And it also came, just like the order, in four classes. And it could not be awarded to officers. That's very important to understand. Up until very late in World War I and the provisional government.
So this was an enlisted.
This was strictly an
specific award.
enlisted man's award. And likewise, no enlisted man could receive Order of St. George. That was reserved for officers only. And as a matter of fact, it was an extremely exclusive award, even to officers. There were some 20 people who received the first class over the entire history of Russian Empire.
Yeah.
And just a handful of the second classes were ever issued. So any of them is quite rare. And for Badge of Distinction, and the name Zovo is just a Russian abbreviation of that name.
Okay.
Знак отличия военного округа, or военного ордена is the Russian name of it, and it abbreviates as Zovo.
And this is an actual Russian-Turkish award.
Yes, and how
era.
we can tell that is, first of all, by the way it looks. You will notice, if you remember, how the typical World War I St. George Cross looks, and looks very different, generally speaking, but the difference is in the eyelet. You see the shape of the island that's very specific to the early issues. There are some other characteristics that make it different, but most importantly, when you look at the back of it, the serial number will tell you the story. You can see that the way the number looks is very different. The font is different, but also it's a very low serial number, at least for the 4th class. What you see during World War I, serial numbers that are 6-digit at least, and some of them go over 1 million.
Yeah.
But it's always way, way higher than this one. And this serial number is actually very important because there is a record of practically all of them, or at least large portion of them, that still exists. And each number is associated with the name of a soldier.
And in this particular case, this cross was actually awarded to a sergeant major during the Balkans and during that fight there in that war. So, which is the reason why I selected it, to make sure it came from that era.
It's from the same campaign.
Correct. And, my family, due to the Second World War, like all their mementos and everything would have been completely lost. And so none of their originals exist in our care. So I wanted to recreate what could have been there and also become a caretaker for those medals indefinitely, as a representative to who he was, this sergeant major, and to basically have a dual purpose, to respect the original owner of it, but now to also show something for my side of the family as well.
All right, so going from this one, by the way, it's wonderful condition for a Russo-Turkish War award.
Thank you.
They don't often come like this, and
Yeah.
it's actually hard to find one
really hard.
in any condition. Not many of them survived. Then you have medal for zeal,
Yes.
awarded already during the reign of Alexander III.
And so the military, it wasn't a guarantee that anyone would get a Zeal Medal for their complete service, but I felt it was appropriate in the case of this situation, since he was part of that original class of conscripts, proved himself. That whole generation of soldiers that were there that demonstrated themselves admirably during the war. The records of the officers talking about the Jewish soldiers are almost always glowing and surprised a lot of people. So I think that their professionalism and their history just warrants to the 15 years that he gave there as an emblem of his service.
And the Medal for Zeal actually could be awarded for length of service.
Correct.
To professional soldiers.
Yes.
Mostly NCOs.
Mostly, yes. And in this case, I forgot to tell you, all of my ancestors were just privates. And that was also because Jews rarely were promoted. Although you will find individuals that could be a sergeant major or, something in that, and we're talking about enlisted, not officers for a moment, but the enlisted guys generally just stayed privates. They would not moving them on up. And we need to also tell the audience that the NCO Corps of Russia is not the same as what we think of it in America at all, so do not get confused there, like a private versus a sergeant and in the modern era. This is not the same. There are some similarities, but still the professional element of it is definitely different. And yeah, so that's the Zeal. If you have other.
No, it's again wonderful condition. You see a little bit of wear to the edge, to the raised edge, which is absolutely normal. But the details are beautifully preserved. And look at very characteristic of an original medal. This shiny field, the mint luster, what they call, is still there. Patina is very even and uniform. You don't see a lot of wear, but there is wear in all the spots where you would expect it to see there. There is a little edge knock here, and basically that's all. Tiny dings to the raised edge, which is what that raised edge is for, protecting the rest of the medal.
Yeah, but it's still beautiful.
The details are beautiful. This one really surprises me because it's in fantastic shape for a Russo-Turkish War medal.
The gilding on it was immaculate.
And the inscription here is not to us, not unto us, not unto us, but in thy name, And again, fantastic condition, beautiful details. And this is certainly what your ancestor would have done.
Absolutely.
We can guess about Medal for Zeal or,
Sure, and the
Zovor
exactly.
or Badge of Distinction, but definitely this one, everybody was eligible.
Absolutely.
Regardless of the rank.
And then the last medal here that we'll show you, the Cross of the Danube Crossing. Now, I've seen this rotated one way or the other. I believe that this might be the a front of it officially, but I had rotated it around because I want to show the year on the backside to correspond. But this is a Romanian ward. It's made out of a piece of iron. And
same idea as Iron Cross, right?
Yeah, I guess that would be something like that. Yeah, but without the silver gilting on the edge, you know. But the Romanians awarded this medal to all of the Russian soldiers who participated in the crossing of the Danube, which was the opening phase.
And major undertaking.
Absolutely, and it was probably the only phase of the war
that was very good.
Yeah, that went according to plan.
Then everything got bogged down.
Exactly, and they had some fights in mountain passes and things, and actually the campaign medal, if you were in was it the Shirka Pass or the
Shipka
Pass?
Shipka.
Yeah.
That was terrible.
And that would be a silver medal. A silver campaign medal instead of the bronze or the dark bronze version. So that's important, you know, because I have no way of knowing if he was in that particular element of the campaign. So that would be something to find out if he was in the Battle of Shipka. Yeah, but then we would need to identify which regiment most likely, you know, because there were only a couple in that particular fight. So if I could get my hands on the regimental records, which is not easy.
That was really a touch and go. It could go either way.
It was a loss of materials.
They
ran out of resources. There was, I think, the terrible storms or weather that was taking place, and the supplies were getting difficult time get there, and they just had a lot of problems. You know, it wasn't generally seeing how campaigns progress, you know, if we watch from one stage into the next, you know, until the war is actually concluded, there's always this logistics issue that we often find with the Russian side of the forces especially. But we have to think about that. Wagons that are dragging across, you know, rutted roads and dirt roads and rocky passes, and it's just a very difficult. But they were saved, I think, in the last, you know, in the nick of time by a group of soldiers who hitched a ride on some horses that the Cossacks were riding. And I don't have all the details exact, but you know, but there was a pretty monumental moment, you know, that saved them.
When yes, they were saved in the
when the reinforcements finally showed up.
Right.
And do you know of the story if they were riding on the other guys' horses with them?
That I don't know specifically.
There's something. I don't know if it was the Shirka Pass, but I know there was another event where a bunch of soldiers caught a ride on some horses to help them. Yeah. So there's like two guys riding on a horse, but hundreds of them, right? Like, funny. But so that's I try to give a realistic representation of what somebody should have had, understanding the Jewish history there and why some officers would not give medals, because Jews were not given according to what they should have had, and many thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of citizens. You can go and talk to all kinds of families and hear their stories why somebody wasn't awarded something simply because they were Jewish. So but I think in this particular case, it was just no records, too much history, too much time has gone by, and too many battles and things that destroyed whatever records, and lack of.
No, that's under the circumstances. This is the best you could
try to be as realistic as possible, right?
Yeah. No, that's excellent. Really love it. And let's flip it once again, the right side up.
And you can see the beauty of the details here.
Yeah. Outstanding group.
Yeah, and Alexander III was the emperor at the time.
The reigning emperor, and that's why
it's
appropriate.
That one.
Exactly.
Because the Alexander II Zeal medal would not have been appropriate for someone with only 6 years, you know, or so.
Certainly. But no, a very meaningful group, and thank you for showing it.
Absolutely.
And why don't we now go to the next one, and you tell us about it. All right, so Alan, now the next one, why don't you tell us about this group?
Sure. This is for my great-grandfather Leisure, who was with the 69th Ryazan Infantry Regiment. And what I wanted to do with his rack, having read the combat history of the regiment itself, they were involved in just about every single fight from beginning to end of the war, and not on every front, of course, but wherever they were fighting, and they created quite a reputation for themselves in their bravery, and their enemy really respected the units that they were fighting with there. So again, we'll start from the far right and work our way left. And now some of these medals, in this case, I really want to represent the era that they were coming into the war. So they may not have had this particular medal, for example. This is the mobilization of 1914. Probably would have gone mostly to officers and
or officials who were instrumental.
Officials, exactly.
But it's an important award to have for the reasons that we've already mentioned.
Yes, it demonstrates that he was actually part of the original fighting force that went into the war in 1914. And I think it represents well the fact that they all showed up. You know, it's not like the Russian army had a difficult time getting their soldiers to come to the battle.
No, it was extraordinary, the speed of mobilization. And back in the time of the Great War, the actual fact of mobilization was already considered the declaration of war.
Yes. Yes.
So war needed not to be declared. It's the fact that there was active mobilization of armies, and it was expected it would take a long time.
Exactly.
But in Russia's case, it was conducted so smoothly, believe it or not, for all the talk of Russian bureaucracy. It was done at extraordinary speed, and Russians were able to invade East Prussia far sooner than anybody had expected. And they showed great promise in the area where your ancestors were fighting in the south.
Exactly. Yes. And those events, as they were transpiring, one of the interesting things about the history shows us is that once a mobilization begins, it's almost impossible to stop it. Especially in Russia, they said, because one of the things that Tsar Nicholas II and his uncle, the Archduke, who was the commander-in-chief, that was a major concern of theirs, because they understood once you call full mobilization, it is a declaration of war, because there is no way to stop it. And now you have a fully mobilized force standing on your nation's border, and how is the other side supposed to react to that? Because if you don't mobilize in return, all they have to do is march right in. No one can stop them, you know. So this was why the war accelerated. You know, from the point where the Austrians only wanted to fight the Serbians, but now the Russians are fully mobilized, and that was a threat to Prussia or to the Germans and the German Empire, and so then we see how it all snowballed from there. So, going back to this, I think that just showing both Leisure and Shmuel being part of that mobilization effort, that is why I wanted to include these medals here. So we also have the Romanov 300-year anniversary.
Now, that some would question why this medal is even here. Could you explain why you think it's appropriate?
Yeah. So based on my reading of what was required for the award, if you were involved in any of the local parades that they may have
festivities
and have to do with the celebration of that, and the infantry regiments were almost universally called out in their local areas to march and participate in the
so it wouldn't be necessarily an event in the capital of St. Petersburg or Moscow.
I think those are more of the popular ones, but you could definitely
even
see them elsewhere.
Locally there would be celebrations
as well. Big event, right?
Sure,
and the Tsar, I think, understood, like, you have to remind the people, you can't just
it
come
was
to
a propaganda.
Moscow, right? Exactly. A national propaganda festivity. Right. So, maybe someone who is more expert on the awarding of this particular medal might have a problem with it, but I think it's warranted because they were also in the service.
Yeah, he was still active reserves. And,
exactly.
And absolutely, it's entirely possible that he could be awarded. Now, this medal, there are many versions of it. A lot of them were privately made, and this seems to be like a private issue. But there were also quite a number minted at the state mint. But one could order a medal or even a number of medals for various occasions. There was no restriction on that. And many people eagerly, happily did. And,
Yeah.
and it was very loose, not quite to the extent of Soviet award system, but a lot of very large number of people were awarded
Yeah.
with this one. So.
So
But again, it's in beautiful condition. Even though it's a common medal,
Yeah.
you don't often find them in this kind of condition.
yeah, exactly.
It's gorgeous.
So now this medal is the 100th anniversary of the Patriotic War, which was against Napoleon.
Napoleon,
right?
War of 1812.
1812, correct. And why he was awarded this is that it was given to the members of the regiments that had actually fought against Napoleon during that time. And the
His regiment
and
actually was in
69th
that war.
Ryazan was in the Napoleonic War. So they were entitled to the medal. And of course, they were probably forced to buy it themselves, but maybe the officers and stuff, received.
They were made at the mint. A lot of them were.
Yeah.
made at the
But
mint.
I mean, like you might have to
Would
spend some money or something out
to
of pocket, which was
receive-
not unheard of, for some of the medals.
In case of orders, if you were decorated with an order, it was actually a very significant expense to you,
Yes.
because you were supposed to pay money to the coffers of the order. And some people were put in very difficult financial strain. And there were cases when they would actually pawn their decoration, sell it even for good, and make a bronze copy, would privately order a bronze version from a jeweler just to get some money
Yeah.
to be able to actually pay for the honor of being awarded. Believe it or not.
That is very interesting you bring that up, because a lot of the medals acted as a kind of insurance policy for the soldiers who received the medals, because their families could then take the medals after the soldier had died and sell it back, or turn back to the mint, and they would get cash for the value of
There
that.
was a lot of that going on, especially in the early days, in the times of Catherine the Great, for example. There were cases when soldiers would cut off their eyelets from their medals and try to present them as a ruble coin, because it was very similar, same portrait in the front. And to actually stop this practice, they started issuing medals that were different shape than the ruble. So you have diamond-shaped medals from that period, specifically to prevent some of being
Phenomenal how diverse
being used as money.
Yeah, the use and diversity of use of these metals is phenomenal, because a lot of it is unique only to the Imperial Russians. That how that happened. I cannot say for certain, but I believe they have, if not the most sophisticated, top 2, 3 most sophisticated award systems
in the world.
The complexity and the variety and all of.
Well, it depends on who you compare it with. The Germans, you could say notoriously, famously, had a very large number of decorations in Imperial Germany, because every state had their
Exactly,
own decorations.
and this is a national, unified kind of.
And for
system,
a
right.
unified system, yes, there is in fact. But Russia was a very military-like, you could even say jingoistic in many society. And there were many wars fought against many neighbors over a long time. And also Russian Empire was one of the longest living empires.
Yes.
It was very successful as empires.
And they were one of the first to have medals. Peter the Great and those guys. I'm not sure if there was. I think there may have been medals before him. I'd have to go back and check.
No, I don't think so.
Was he the one who implemented it?
I think he started. There was some
like church pendants or something that
there
may have
were
constituted
were
like a medal
things that were issued,
yeah.
coins,
like portrait
and so forth.
award or something.
Exactly,
like that,
exactly, but not the medals.
So we can, So this is an amazing evolution of awards and medals and how they came about doing so. So, anyways, that.
So now from War of 1812 anniversary.
So he would have been entitled to that based on his part in that regiment at the time that the medal was issued. Okay, so that's the key.
And the portrait is, of course, portrait of Tsar Alexander I, who defeated Napoleon in the war.
And you'll notice that they have a couple different variants, but you'll see his sideburns here. That he's got going there is unique.
His trademark.
Yeah. So
sideburns.
and
he was not a handsome man, and he realized it full well.
Oh, really?
So yeah, he was. Many contemporaries say ugly looking, So you don't see as dignified a portrait as you often see on other medals, because in reality, in truth, he was kind of humble-looking person.
Oh, that's
Now,
interesting.
extremely courageous. Definitely fought to the death with Napoleon. Would not stop, even though he was often being persuaded by allies, by the Austrian allies and Prussian allies, to stop, to make peace with Napoleon. In 1813 or as late as 1814, there were many attempts to reach agreement, and he famously insisted that the war will be ended in Paris. The peace treaty can only be signed in Paris, and he actually achieved what he strived for.
Yeah.
He never forgave Napoleon for the invasion and the
he shouldn't.
humiliation that he
shouldn't.
experienced.
He did exactly the right thing in that. You
Yeah,
know?
well, he understood that Napoleon was a very unstable personality.
Well, he wasn't
would
gonna
never,
stop if he
never
lost the war. He
cease
was gonna come
exactly.
back for
And we know
revenge.
there was actually a comeback.
Plan.
1815. There was a comeback against all odds. So he realized the danger of that, and he said, "No, I absolutely will not stop."
Yeah. And also unique about this variant is the hair, you know, because other variants have long flowing hair. In this case, it's very curly and cropped short. So, you know, there's some of the unique elements that I've picked up on as I've studied these awards. But, you know, this can also trick people because the variants can get so diverse. I think there are maybe like 3 or 4 different hairstyles that I saw of this particular medal. But
okay, and now going on from this medal to the next 2 that look very much alike, would you explain what the differences are?
Okay, so
what they are?
This is the St. George Medal for Bravery 4th class.
Okay, and that's why it's closer to the right side.
So, and then this is the St. George Medal for Bravery 3rd class. And this is why you'll note in Russia, 3rd class and 1st class medals get the special bow. That goes across to denote that. And now we have the actual St. George Cross 4th class and St. George Cross 3rd class. And the reason why I chose these particular medals is just simple based on how many battles Lejeune fought in. Was incredible how many the 69th was in. And, you know, I basically did a 2 battles for every medal kind of a ratio because, you know, they're not sitting around and doing nothing. And, you know, were they able to highlight their exploits and their heroism is, you know, up to history, you know, to reveal that. But if the evidence has been lost, then I have to just go with the fact that if you're surviving these fights, you know, you need to be recognized. And no doubt, he definitely displayed his own personal heroism and bravery during these battles.